What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so Spawn is a really cool concept in the realm of comic books. And I would go as far as to say, when it comes to independent publishers, basically, concepts or characters or teams who are created by people outside of Marvel and DC, Spawn is probably the most popular. Like, I really feel like he is. I mean, back in the early 1990s, you had a lot of really popular creations outside of Marvel and DC. Namely, you had Image and Valiant. But I'd say Spawn is still probably the most popular. And the reason is because he's had an exceedingly long ongoing series. It's been stretching on for a couple decades now, but he's pretty hardcore. So winding the clock back to the early 1990s, you had Jim Valentino, you had Jim Lee, you had Todd McFarlane, you had a whole bunch of people who basically broke away from the mainline comic book publishers. And the reason for this was that where Steve Gerber did successfully, I don't think he successfully did it, where he did sue Marvel Comics over the rights to Howard the Duck. What that did is it created a creator's bill of rights, things that like creators were basically entitled to. The problem with this was that characters and concept had to basically walk rank and file with like what was expected of those characters. You know, for example, like Captain America couldn't just become a villain all of a sudden like you saw in Secret Empire. That had to be built up to, or something had to be done, but it's certainly not something they would have done back in the 1990s. And so where people will kind of like live in that era of comics and not really step into the modern day and just kind of say like, that's the way things should always be. The fact remains that what you had is you had a handful of creators who quit. They basically walked away and said, we're tired of writing somebody else's characters. We want to create our own characters. Thus we got Image Comics. And Image Comics is a publishing house much in the same way as Marvel and DC. The difference is that where Marvel and DC have a shared universe, meaning that in Marvel Comics, the Avengers will cross over with the X-Men, and DC Comics, the Justice League will cross over with the Teen Titans, and Image Comics, you don't really have that. Image is just like a giant publishing house for all kinds of just creator-owned work. You've got Jonathan Hickman's East of West, you've got Todd McFarlane's Spawn. And the idea of Spawn was to take the kind of superhero archetype that existed at the time and somewhat modify it, adjust it, and then throw it back at the reader. So if I were a betting man, I would say that Spawn is kind of like a hodgepodge of a bunch of different characters. He's one part Batman, one part Punisher. I mean, he's got all these different things sort of wrapped into a cool bow. And the way this really picks up, the way this really shows itself is when the story starts. By and large, when it comes to character origin stories in comic books, you usually get the origin story almost right off the bat within the first 6 issues, or at least the character, like a set of events unfold and the character becomes a superhero or becomes a supervillain. In the Spawn series, Spawn doesn't know how he got there. He doesn't really remember anything. All we know is that there's like a 5-year gap between the time he basically died and the time that he woke up. He gets these small little flashes here and there, these small little faces. He sees himself involved in various conflicts overseas, different things like that, but that's about it. But the one thing that sticks in his mind is this beautiful woman that he can't quite figure out. He doesn't really know who she is. And that's one of the big differences here, is that Spawn picks up basically putting pieces of his life together and not really understanding how he got where he was. But the funny thing about this too is that it's basically our ability to follow the story of Spawn as he learns who he is as an anti-hero more than anything else. But it's kind of cool here because what you end up doing, really the first big thing that he does is he immediately leaps into action. Now, this is kind of like Todd McFarlane playing on the nature of superheroes, right? I mean, we're not really given a whole lot of expose into like the character of Spawn. We just kind of know he's there and he's a person who can presumably do things. And so it's one of those situations where the actions of his character are designed to tell us who he is, as opposed to him giving us this huge explanation. Now, the other thing to bear in mind here is that this is very reminiscent of late 80s and early 90s comics. A lot of the characters that you're really familiar with in comic books, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, all those characters that you're familiar with, they've been around since the 1960s or earlier, going all the way back to like the late 30s, early 40s, into the 50s, and so on and so forth. And so because of the fact that the nature of storytelling in comics between the introduction of Superman running all the way up until about the late 1970s kind of followed the pattern of saying, okay, I'm a superhero, here I am, and here's what I do, here's how I gain my abilities if I have any, that kind of went away. And instead, when you had like Rob Liefeld method of storytelling, which really goes all the way back to like the latter days of New Mutants going into the launch of X-Force, it was kind of like just on the scene. We know that with characters like Cable. Cable was just there one day. There was no real explanation of where he came from, how he got there. We didn't get that until the X-Force series started. And even then it was lightly teased in X-Force issue number 6 or whatever it was. And then we got an actual explanation in Cable's solo series. So it took a little while for us to actually get that information together. And that translates into this. But the nature of Spawn comes into sharp relief in the sense that he immediately jumps in and stops a handful of guys from basically like attacking a young woman, basically, trying to victimize her more or less. Now, of course, he makes quick work of these guys, but notice the kind of things that he says. He's basically like, look, you guys clearly picked the wrong one, like I'm here to stop you guys, that kind of a thing. But then suddenly he gets a flashback to like his own funeral, like a military style funeral. It's really Todd McFarlane taking this whole idea of Spawn and taking like the Rob Liefeld method of storytelling, for example, rolling it over into this whole thing and saying, now here's little tidbits here and there about like how this whole concept came into existence. But the idea is that Spawn is still literally trying to figure himself out. Now, another way that this is shown here is when he basically starts to remove his garb and ends up finding out that his flesh is almost totally destroyed. So again, he's still figuring these things out. Now, at this point, we actually jump to this sort of demonic entity. This guy's name is basically Malebolgia. That's really who he is. Now, the role he plays at the beginning of the Spawn series, it's the tip of the iceberg with regards to like the grander scheme of everything that's going on. That's one of the reasons why Spawn has lasted for so long, is because it's very much like this massive world building epic, that deals with angels and demons and different things like that. And so from here, we basically pick up with the introduction of the Violator. Now, to be honest, to kind of, inject my opinion in here, I love Violator. I think Violator's hilarious. And that's the way he was designed to be. The Spawn comics in and of themselves were designed to be some pretty dark comics. And so when it comes to the Violator, he's one part dark humor and then one part just like sadistic and screwed up. And this is because he really kind of opens up with him rambling on about all the different ways to like kill a person, to basically take out Spawn, different things like that, to like rip his spine out through his head and so on and so forth. Just really kind of being screwed up and sadistic. But at the same time, for Spawn himself, it really is just going through and trying to understand himself. Now, that's kind of one of the downsides about the early Spawn stories. Todd McFarlane spent a lot of time with Spawn just sort of like thinking about who he is and trying to figure himself out. Honestly, I wouldn't go as far as to say this is like a necessity to have all this stuff, but it's really just one of these things where he kind of reflects on the world around him, because he really is like a guy who sort of wakes up with no real identity, amnesia almost. And so again, switching back to the Violator, we basically join Dawn Corp, where we basically have this mob boss, more or less. And the Violator's going through and killing each of these guys. But notice this, he's actually ripping their hearts out in the process, which is pretty screwed up. Like it's pretty messed up seeing it all unfold. But this is when we start to learn things about the kind of powers that Spawn has. One of these is to take on the form of another person. Now, the implication, or I guess the indication here, is that because he doesn't really have a strong understanding of his abilities, it happens outside of his desire, meaning it's almost like an impulse, a subconscious kind of mechanism that kicks in that he can't necessarily control. It creates a bit of mystery and it creates a bit of intrigue. Spawn is learning about his powers and we're learning about them at the same time. And while all this is taking place, we suddenly start to get a little more information here. And we basically pick up with a guy by the name of Jason Wynn. Now, this is kind of cool because again, this feeds into traditional comic book landscapes where you've got the arch nemesis, is really how this whole thing unfolds. Now, what we're told here is that with Jason Wynn, he was basically the mentor of Spawn, the mentor of Al Simmons, essentially. That he had taken Al Simmons under his wing and he had turned him into really a prodigious assassin. And what this did is it basically led to this revelation on behalf of Al Simmons that as time began to progress, that really Jason Wynn took enjoyment in essentially like bringing harm to others. It wasn't enough to just like execute these Black Ops campaigns at the request of the federal government. He had to go a step further, really carry out these missions, but do it in a way where he was more vindictive than he needed to be. And as time began to progress, Jason Wynn began to enjoy inflicting pain on others. And so because of this, at some point along the line, and the way things seem to be indicated here, is that Al Simmons intended to like turn on Jason Wynn, to basically turn him in, reveal the things that he'd done so he'd be put on trial for, various war crimes, so on and so forth. And the idea seems to be that Al Simmons was taken out as a result of his intentions here. And so again, as time goes on, we'll begin to figure out more and more. We'll see more and more about the origin of Al himself. And so where Spawn kind of has this interesting situation where he kind of collapses, just being overwhelmed by the various memories that are occasionally flooding back into his mind, he's met by the Violator proper. And this is kind of cool because while the Violator does look pretty screwed up, in juxtaposition to Spawn, he looks pretty harmless. He doesn't look like he can do a whole lot. He looks like a crazy clown with face paint. But the funny thing here is that we also get little bits of comedy, in the sense that like he basically relieves himself more or less. Now, I'm going to say to this day too, one of the really the only depiction of the Violator we ever got in film was John Leguizamo, but he was amazeballs. Oh my God. Like if you guys never saw the Spawn movie, like John Leguizamo was the highlight of that movie. He was hilarious. But again, the Violator just kind of has it out for Spawn, the intention to basically kill him and eliminate him in his entirety. We're not told why Violator has it out for Spawn. We just know that he does. And so again, like from this point, you pick up with Malebolgia himself, this actual demon, and Malebolgia begins to kind of fill us in on a few two things. And what we end up finding out here is that within the confines of this story, at least here in the early days, Malebolgia is basically the ruler of hell, or at least that seems to be the case. Now again, this is Todd McFarlane drawing on his time in Marvel Comics, because for those people who have been reading Spawn for any real measure of time, Malebolgia bears a striking similarity to Mephisto. They look completely different, well not really completely different, but they look very different from one another, but the roles seem relatively similar. Now, the motivation behind Malebolgia is really what differentiates him from Mephisto, but the point still remains the same. In Marvel Comics, Mephisto is a being who rules over a dimension of hell. Mephisto takes the souls of those he tricks. And so that's why, like, he took the soul of Dr. Doom's mom, for example. With Malebolgia, it's much the same way. The difference here is that Malebolgia really seems to indicate that, like, Spawn is going to serve a particular purpose, that Spawn is here for a very particular reason. And the reason really seems to be that, one, Spawn basically handed his soul over to Malebolgia, and two, he didn't read the fine print. He didn't know what was entailed in handing his soul over and presumably allowing him to return to Earth. Now again, this is small little tidbits being thrown in here, small little things here and there. Not a lot of information is being given by Todd McFarlane. It's just kind of giving us these small little tidbits and allowing us to try to use our imagination to fill in the pieces. But from here, Spawn takes the most logical step in his character. And again, it's kind of a way for McFarlane to kind of give us this sort of tour of like the Spawn mythos, in the sense that Al basically dons the physical appearance of the blonde guy he's basically been mimicking from time to time and goes back to his own home, only to basically find Wanda there. Now, the cool thing about this is that Wanda looks just as beautiful as he ever remembers. For Al basically coming back home and visiting his wife, it's really not so much a desire to like rekindle things, so much as it is to figure out what's going on with her and to understand where she is at the moment. The sad thing about this is that when he basically gets to his home, he finds out that his former wife has a daughter. And this is kind of crushing to him because it's the one thing he could never give her. Now, the indication seems to be that the reason why he was never able to give it to her is because his job just required too much. His job required too much time away. He wasn't able to pay as much attention to his wife as he should have. And the result was that when he began to realize how important she truly was, she was already gone. Not only that, we actually end up finding out that she married a guy named Terry. And Terry was basically the former partner of Al Simmons. And the two of them had basically grown closer through the death of Al. And so it makes sense that as time progressed, the two of them ended up getting together. And so this is kind of an interesting scenario here, because it's one of those things where the way it's done by Todd McFarlane, Al basically has to let go. Like, he has to move on. He can't be with his wife, but to see her happy is more important than being happy with her. And so that's the cool thing about this, is that he ultimately just kind of walks away. Now, the sad thing is that he's basically dealing with the idea that like some unseen force out there whom he doesn't really seem to know much about seems to be like kind of toying with his life and basically putting him in a situation where everything that's been valuable to him has been taken away. And so in this moment of vulnerability, he's suddenly met by the arrival of the Violator. Now, of course, the Violator does to him what the Violator's been doing to a lot of other people and rips out the heart of Spawn. But this again goes into the nature of Spawn's powers, in the sense that when he's basically left dead, he kind of jumps back up again, begins to heal, and the revelation here is that he doesn't actually need a heart. And so the idea seems to be that Spawn is technically immortal. He cannot really be killed by conventional means. Now, it kind of brings in this whole thing of, well, what does he have to lose here? From here, like, Spawn and Violator actually get into a pretty cool fight. Now, Violator is actually a little shocked because in his mind, he's kind of like, how do you not die? Like, you're a human. How could you possibly live without a heart? And so it's kind of funny because Violator doesn't quite know how to handle this situation. Of course, Spawn takes his heart, puts it back into his chest, and that's really the end of that. But the way that he talks is he immediately sees Violator as an enemy. And this again is a way for McFarlane to kind of set things up and say that once the whole situation with Jason Wynn is sorted out, the Violator will go on to be the main enemy of Spawn. That's the indication that's given in this whole story here. And so, well, the two of them do get into a pretty knockdown, drag out fight that really like sees Violator getting like a hole blown into him and like his arm ripped off and different things like that. Ultimately, you end up having Malebolgia, who simply just pops up here. And this is when we start to get the explanation of what's going on. This is when we start to learn everything that's happening. Malebolgia essentially pops up and says, both of you are on the same side. You're servants for me. You just don't know it yet. But the funny thing about this is that Malebolgia goes on to explain that basically it's this ruler of hell and its goal is to destroy God. But the reason why Spawn is here is because Spawn is designed to basically increase the army of Malebolgia, to essentially like punish those who are evil and wicked or what have you and send their souls to hell. That's the point that he serves here. And the reason why is because Malebolgia intends to build an army that's large enough to challenge and conquer God and then bring an end to like his whole reign. And that's the whole basis behind why Spawn is here. Now, the funny thing about this, and this is where the anti-hero element begins to come into play, is that Malebolgia says, look, the way this works is that the more you use your powers, the closer you come to like a second death. Basically meaning if you go nuts with all your powers, if you just use your powers for an extreme purpose, then you'll basically start decreasing your life at a faster rate and your soul will belong to me. Or you can use your powers slower and then eventually I'll get your soul anyway, but you won't be able to punish the wicked. And so the idea is that no matter what happens, Malebolgia will get the soul of Spawn. The funny thing about this too is that Malebolgia actually says here that in this particular circumstance, and really in any particular circumstance around the world, that when it comes to individuals whose souls are harnessed by Malebolgia, he can't just steal them. Al Simmons had to offer his soul. And so in a sense, Al Simmons sold his soul to the devil for whatever it is the end goal was. And so because of that, that's how Malebolgia was able to steal the whole basis behind him. Now, the whole concept here seems to be, and really to provide a bit of a spoiler here for future stories, the way this basically unfolded is that Spawn sold his soul to Malebolgia under the idea that he would basically be allowed to quote unquote return to Earth. And the whole basis was to gain revenge, but he would serve as like the Hellspawn. But when he showed back up here, his memory was essentially wiped with the exception of a small few tidbits here and there. And so what this meant was that Al Simmons went forward as the Hellspawn and really kind of gets us to the moment where he's trying to figure himself out. But that's the whole point here, is that when it comes to the Violator, he seemed to be more of someone who kept Spawn in check, or at least keeps him on the path he's supposed to serve. But that's where the anti-hero element comes in, is because as we know, Spawn will go on to basically defy Malebolgia at every opportunity he gets to serve his purpose of like punishing the wicked, but really like pushing them more on the path of doing the right thing, as opposed to like expanding the army of Malebolgia. Now there'll be times where it's unavoidable, but that's kind of the role that he serves at this moment in time. And so the result here is that the way this really kind of begins to come to an end is that it's basically Spawn and its Violator on two opposite sides. They serve the same purpose, but they're none too friendly with each other. They're not allies. And so what you have is, you know, just Spawn kind of going about and doing his thing, basically going forward into the next few stories, where we begin to expand on his character a little bit more, learn a little bit more about his past and all that kind of good stuff. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.